Plagues didn't just terrify people, they vaporized common sense. Every outbreak turned entire cities into panic labs where fear replaced logic and safety became pure comedy. In this video, we're breaking down 44 of the dumbest, wildest, and most unbelievable things people actually did to protect themselves. Trust me, history was far more unhinged than the internet on a bad day. 1. The Vicary method is proof that historical doctors were basically just guessing and hoping for the best. Their grand idea for curing a major illness was to prescribe a cuddle session with a shaved chicken. The medical experts genuinely believed that a plucked hen had the magical ability to act like a vacuum cleaner and suck the sickness right out of your body. Imagine the awkwardness of lying in bed while a serious physician walks in, ignores the medicine cabinet, and tapes a confused farm animal to your chest. If the chicken got sick, they high-fived each other for a job well done and just grabbed another bird, turning the hospital room into a bizarre petting zoo until the patient either recovered or they simply ran out of poultry. 2. While we complain about bad smells today, medieval geniuses decided that the ultimate weapon against the plague was a jar of their own flatulence. Since they thought the disease was caused by bad air, they figured the only way to fight it was to create a personal force field of even worse air. This led to the absolute comedy of wealthy merchants hoarding their own gas in jars like it was a rare, expensive perfume. When the plague arrived, these folks would calmly unscrew the lid and take a massive, confident whiff of their own supply. It is the only time in history where "who cut the cheese" was not an insult, but a legitimate medical survival strategy that people took very seriously. 3. Pope Gregory IX accidentally fired the only competent employees in Europe when he decided that cats were up to no good. He declared that felines were suspicious characters, so the superstitious population chased them all out of town to purify the streets. The hilarious irony is that the cats were the unpaid security guards keeping the rat population in check. By getting rid of the bouncers, the people effectively rolled out the red carpet and invited every rat in the continent to a massive buffet in their pantries. They thought they were being spiritually safe, but they just handed the keys to the city over to the rodents, who promptly moved in and took over the neighborhood. 4. It sounds like a prank from a rebellious teenager, but schools in the 1600s actually made smoking a mandatory subject. The health experts were 100% certain that tobacco smoke was a miracle shield that varnished the lungs and kept the sickness out. At fancy boarding schools, the morning routine wasn't about learning math or grammar, but ensuring every child was puffing on a pipe like a miniature steam engine. There is a famous record of a student named Tom Rogers who got detention, not for smoking behind the gym, but because he refused to smoke his pipe during class. It is the only time in history where a nicotine addiction was a graduation requirement and saying no to a cigarette would get you a stern lecture from the principal. 5. If you were ultra-rich and thought regular medicine was for peasants, you could choose the premium cure of eating crushed emeralds. The logic was entirely based on capitalism, assuming that if a rock was expensive and shiny, it must have superpowers when you eat it. Kings and nobles would grind these green gems into a powder and mix them with their lunch, essentially paying a fortune to eat a bowl of glittery sand. It turns out that the human stomach really does not care about the market value of your jewelry, and eating stones is generally a terrible idea. These elites were paying top dollar for a meal with zero nutritional value, proving that having a castle full of gold does not mean you have a single ounce of common sense. 6. Some medical professionals decided that the best way to avoid the plague was to hang out in a smelly sewer. The theory was that the potent aroma of a latrine was strong enough to bully the disease away, so people treated the local waste dump like a luxury health resort. Doctors would actually prescribe a daily visit to the cesspit, instructing patients to lean over and breathe deeply as if they were smelling fresh roses. It is hard to imagine the level of desperation required to look at a hole in the ground filled with waste and think it looks like the perfect spot for some aromatherapy. They were essentially trying to stay healthy by marinating themselves in the absolute worst perfume that mankind has ever created. 7. When they ran out of actual medical ideas, the experts decided that spelling lessons were the next best line of defense. The word abracadabra was considered a heavy-duty medical device, not just a trick for children's parties. Doctors instructed patients to write the word on parchment in a triangle shape, removing one letter on each line until the word disappeared at the bottom. You had to wear this piece of paper around your neck, believing that, as the word vanished, the sickness would just get the hint and leave too. It is fascinating that grown men with degrees looked at a sick patient and decided the most effective treatment was a geometry puzzle and a necklace made of homework. 8. While we love a hot shower, people in the past were terrified of bathing because they thought it was a death trap. The medical wisdom of the day claimed that hot water opened up your pores and invited the bad plague air to walk right into your body. To stay safe, folks decided the smartest strategy was to build up a thick, protective layer of natural dirt and never wash it off. They effectively wore their own grime like a suit of armor, convinced that being squeaky clean was dangerous. It was a unique time in history where having terrible body odor and being covered in dust was actually considered a sign of peak physical health and responsible living. 9. If you thought bottling farts was the peak of disgusting ideas, the medical experts said, "Hold my drink," because they genuinely prescribed drinking urine. The logic was that urine was a sterile fluid that could flush the system, so doctors recommended a nice warm glass of your own supply every morning to keep the plague away. For those who could not stomach the idea of a liquid breakfast, they offered a spa alternative where you would bathe in a tub of stored urine to let it soak into your pores. It creates a horrific image of a wealthy noble rejecting a fine wine to sip on a vintage glass of number 1, convinced that smelling like a public restroom was the ultimate status symbol of health and vitality. 10. For those who wanted to accessorize while fighting a deadly disease, the trendiest item was the spider amulet. People were instructed to catch a live spider, shove the poor creature into a hollow walnut shell, and wear it around their neck like a piece of high-fashion jewelry. The theory was that the spider would absorb the poison from the air, acting like a tiny, 8-legged air filter dangling on your chest. It is hilarious to think that the ultimate protection plan involved carrying a confused bug in a nut, and if the spider eventually died from starvation, the owner would celebrate, thinking the brave little guy had sacrificed himself to save them from the plague. 11. Scams are not a modern invention because medieval pharmacists made a fortune selling powdered unicorn horn to gullible customers. Since nobody had ever actually seen a unicorn, clever salesmen would take the tusk of a narwhal, grind it up, and sell it as magical horse dust that could cure absolutely anything. Wealthy buyers would pay the price of a small castle for a pouch of this stuff, believing that sprinkling it on their food would turn them into Superman. They were essentially eating ground-up whale teeth for the price of diamonds, proving that if you package something nicely and give it a cool name, people will buy it even if it is completely mythical nonsense. 12. Since the plague was invisible, some town officials decided that the best way to fight it was to literally scream at it with heavy artillery. Cities would fire massive cannons and ring church bells continuously for hours, believing that the loud noise would break up the clouds of miasma and scare the sickness away. It is a strategy that basically amounts to trying to punch the wind, as they thought that germs had ears and would run away if things got too loud. The only thing they actually achieved was causing permanent hearing loss for the entire neighborhood and waking up every baby in a 5-mile radius, while the plague continued to spread completely unimpressed by the noise pollution. 13. If you had a sweet tooth, you might have enjoyed the treacle cure, which was basically eating extremely old, spoiled syrup. Doctors believed that treacle, which is a byproduct of sugar production, had to be aged for at least 10 years to become effective against the plague. People would frantically search for the oldest, stickiest, most fermented jar of sludge they could find, believing that the foul taste meant it was working. It is the culinary equivalent of finding a fuzzy container in the back of your fridge and deciding it must be medicine because it looks terrible. They were essentially cementing their teeth together with ancient sugar goo, convinced that diabetes was the secret weapon against the Black Death. 14. The plague doctor outfit is the ultimate proof that fashion can be terrifyingly stupid. Doctors genuinely believed that wearing a mask with a gigantic, foot-long beak filled with flowers would filter out the disease. They walked around looking like oversized Gothic pigeons, poking people with sticks to see if they were still alive. The idea was that the herbs in the beak would smell nice enough to confuse the plague, but in reality, they just looked like nightmares dressed in leather coats. It is hard to take medical advice seriously when the guy giving it looks like a bird that is about to rob a bank, but people were desperate enough to trust a man wearing a Halloween costume as their savior. 15. If you love the smell of raw onions, you would have thrived during the plague because people rubbed them on everything. The medical advice was to slice up onions and rub them all over your body until you smelled like a walking hamburger. They believed the onion juice had magical properties that would trap the infection, so families would scatter chopped onions around their living rooms like air fresheners. It is hilarious to imagine a serious town meeting where everyone is crying, not because of the tragedy, but because the entire room smells like a prep station at a fast food restaurant. They were effectively seasoning themselves like steaks, hoping the plague was a picky eater. 16. Drinking mercury was a legitimate medical prescription, proving that doctors were basically trying to kill you faster than the disease could. They gave patients a glass of liquid metal, also known as quicksilver, believing its heavy weight would push the sickness out of the body. It is actually mind-blowing that they looked at a toxic substance that destroys your brain and kidneys and thought it looked like a refreshing beverage. Patients would chug this silver sludge and immediately feel terrible, which the doctors interpreted as the medicine working perfectly. It was a time when the cure was literally a heavy metal cocktail that turned your internal organs into a chemistry experiment gone wrong. 17. Pope Clement VI came up with a survival strategy that basically involved turning himself into a human barbecue. His doctors told him to sit in the middle of 2 roaring fires in the middle of a hot summer to burn away the bad air. For weeks, the leader of the church just sat there sweating profusely between giant bonfires, refusing to let anyone get close to him. The funny thing is that it actually worked, not because of magic, but because the intense heat kept the flea-infested rats away. He accidentally survived by roasting himself like a marshmallow, proving that sometimes the dumbest-looking ideas yield the best results purely by mistake. 18. If you were rich and lazy, the visual cure was the perfect excuse to just stare at your own money. Doctors told wealthy patients that staring at gold and precious jewels would comfort the heart and scare away the sickness. Nobles would spend hours just sitting in a chair, aggressively looking at their gold coins and diamond rings, believing that the shine was beaming health into their eyes. It is the ultimate rich person logic to think that you can cure a deadly virus just by looking at how wealthy you are. While the peasants were eating onions and smelling toilets, the elite were essentially treating the plague by window shopping in their own jewelry boxes. 19. The legend of the 4 thieves vinegar sounds like a bad heist movie plot. A group of robbers managed to loot the homes of plague victims without getting sick, and when they were caught, they revealed their secret weapon was a special salad dressing. They had soaked garlic and herbs in vinegar and rubbed it on themselves before going on their crime spree. The absurdity is that people immediately started buying this thieves vinegar, not to rob houses, but just to smell like an Italian antipasto platter to stay safe. It is amazing that the most trusted medical product of the time was basically a recipe for a vinaigrette invented by a gang of criminals. 20. Eating dirt is usually something you stop doing as a toddler, but during the plague, it was a high-end medical treatment called terra sigillata. This was literally just clay that was dug up from a specific hill, stamped with a fancy official seal, and sold as medicine. People would pay good money to eat these little cakes of mud, believing the earth had magical absorbing powers. It is hilarious that con artists could just shovel dirt into a bag, put a sticker on it, and sell it to desperate adults who happily chewed on it. They were paying premium prices for the privilege of eating a mud pie, convinced it was a sophisticated pharmaceutical product. 21. Since alcohol kills germs on the outside, people figured it must do the same on the inside, leading to the brandy cure. The strategy was to stay aggressively drunk from morning until night so that the body would be too preserved for the plague to enter. It was less of a medical treatment and more of a massive excuse for the entire town to party while the world ended. You had doctors actually prescribing heavy drinking, telling patients to gulp down strong spirits until they couldn't feel their own face. It didn't cure the plague, but it certainly made people care a lot less about it. turning a medical crisis into the world's longest and unhealthiest happy hour. 22. The Bezoar stone sounds like a mystical artifact from a fantasy movie, but in reality, it was just a glorified hairball from a goat's stomach. Wealthy people paid absolute fortunes for these calcified lumps of indigestible trash found in the guts of farm animals. The belief was that dipping the stone into your wine or water would infuse the drink with anti-plague magic. It is essentially the grossest teabag in history. Imagine sitting at a high-class dinner, watching a nobleman drop a crusty lump of goat waste into his goblet and sipping it with his pinky up, convinced that drinking barnyard leftovers was the height of medical sophistication. 23. If you hate going to the gym, you would have loved the medical advice during the plague, because doctors officially banned exercise. The theory was that heavy breathing from running or working out would suck in more of the poisoned air, filling your lungs with death faster. So, the prescription for survival was literally to become a couch potato, sit still, and breathe as shallowly as possible. It is the only time in human history where being lazy and refusing to move was not considered a bad habit, but a tactical survival maneuver performed by the most health-conscious citizens. 24. To fight the bad smells of the plague, the rich carried pomanders, which were fancy balls of perfume, but the main ingredient was often ambergris, which is literally whale vomit. This waxy substance comes from the digestive system of a sperm whale, and people rubbed it on their necks or sniffed it constantly to stay safe. It is a hilarious paradox where the elite were too snobbish to smell the city streets, so they decided the better alternative was to walk around smelling like the regurgitated lunch of a giant sea creature. They were effectively wearing expensive seafood puke as a cologne and thinking they were the classiest people in the room. 25. Doctors realized they couldn't cure the body, so they tried to gaslight the brain with the happiness prescription. Medical texts actually advised people to avoid sad thoughts, bad news, or thinking about death, because they believed that sadness opened the pores and let the plague in. The official medical advice was essentially, "Don't worry, be happy, or you will die." Families were told to tell jokes, sing songs, and listen to upbeat music while the world ended outside their window. It was the original version of toxic positivity, where feeling grumpy for even 5 minutes was considered a life-threatening medical condition. 26. In a stroke of genius that defies all logic, some people decided that the best way to fight the plague was to eat actual poison. Desperate citizens would consume small doses of arsenic or mercury, believing that these toxic substances would kill the disease before it killed them. It was a bizarre game of chicken played with their own internal organs, trying to make their bodies so toxic that even the plague would not want to live there. They were basically turning themselves into human toxic waste dumps, confusing the symptoms of slow poisoning with the feeling of robust health. 27. The dried toad amulet was exactly what it sounds like, a piece of amphibian jerky worn as a necklace. People would catch a toad, dry it out in the sun until it was crispy, and hang it over their chest, specifically near the heart. The belief was that the toad would swell up and explode if it absorbed the plague poison from the air, acting like a biological landmine. It is hilarious to picture a society where the hottest fashion accessory was a dehydrated frog on a string. If the toad didn't swell up, they didn't think the science was wrong. They just assumed the toad was lazy and went to find a better one. 28. If you valued your hair, the plague was a bad time for you because some experts recommended shaving your entire head to stay safe. The theory was that hair acted like a net that trapped the sticky, poisonous miasma particles floating in the air. To prevent this, men and women would shave their heads completely smooth, believing that the plague would just slide off their shiny skulls like water off a duck. It created a look that was less fashion-forward and more escaped convict. But people were convinced that being bald was the ultimate aerodynamic defense against invisible germs. 29. Queen Elizabeth I was known for her love of sugar, but during outbreaks, she and other nobles used puppies as medical sponges. The idea was to take a live puppy and rub it gently on your stomach or hold it in your lap. They believed the youth and heat of the dog would absorb the sickness from the human, transferring any bad humors into the canine. It sounds ridiculous, but it was basically the first instance of emotional support animals, except they expected the dog to literally suck the virus out of their belly button. It was a cure that relied entirely on the magical healing power of warm cuddles. 30. Before hand sanitizer existed, people invented the royal touch, which was basically the worst VIP meet and greet in history. The belief was that the king was chosen by God, so his magical fingers could cure disease just by poking you. Thousands of sick people would line up for days, coughing and sneezing on each other just to get a quick high five from the monarch. It is hilarious to think that the ultimate healthcare plan was just go touch the guy in the fancy hat. Instead of social distancing, they created a super spreader event led by the king himself, who was probably frantically washing his hands the moment the cameras were off. 31. We all know money is dirty, but during the plague, merchants took it to a whole new level with vinegar coins. Shopkeepers were terrified that customers' cash was covered in invisible death, so they set up bowls of vinegar at the counter. You had to drop your coins into the bowl to disinfect them before the transaction could happen. It was the medieval version of contactless payment, but instead of a chip reader, you had a salad bowl filled with sour liquid. It is funny to imagine buying a loaf of bread and having to fish your wet, smelly change out of a jar of pickle juice just to prove you weren't a biological weapon. 32. If you couldn't afford expensive incense to purify the air, the budget-friendly advice was to burn your own shoes. Doctors told the poor that the smell of burning leather and old rubber was offensive enough to scare the plague away. Families would gather around a fire, throwing their old boots into the flames and inhaling the thick, toxic black smoke like it was fresh mountain air. It is a level of desperation where you are literally destroying your own wardrobe to create a smell that is actually worse than the disease. They were essentially hotboxing their homes with the scent of burnt foot sweat and calling it medicine. 33. Blaming your problems on astrology is popular today, but during the plague, it was the official scientific explanation. The smartest people in Paris declared that the Black Death wasn't caused by germs, but because Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars were having a meeting in the sky that went wrong. They genuinely believed that the planets were angry and shooting rays of bad vibes down to Earth. It is the ultimate lack of accountability. Instead of cleaning up the trash in the streets, they looked up at space and said, "Well, Mars is being a jerk today, so I guess we'll just die." It was the original version of blaming everything on Mercury being in retrograde. 34. Sleeping became a tactical sport because doctors advised that lying on your back was a death sentence. The theory was that your pores opened up when you slept, and if you lay flat, the heavy poisonous air would settle into your nose like gravity-fed water. People were terrified to get comfortable, so they propped themselves up with pillows or slept sitting upright in chairs for weeks. Imagine being exhausted from surviving a pandemic, but you are too scared to lie down because you think gravity is conspiring with the virus to kill you. It turned bedtime into a high-stakes game of Jenga with your own body. 35. If you were hungry, this cure would be disappointing because the bread sponge method involved wasting perfectly good food. The advice was to bake a loaf of bread, and while it was still steaming hot, cut it in half and tape it to your buboes, the swelling. They thought the heat and yeast would act like a magnet and pull the poison out of the body and into the dough. After the bread got cold, you had to bury it in the ground, effectively planting a plague sandwich. It is hilarious that in the middle of a food shortage, people were taping dinner to their armpits instead of eating it. 36. The Mithridate was the ultimate snake oil smoothie, a medicine so complex that nobody actually knew if it worked. It was a universal antidote made from over 60 different random ingredients, including opium, crushed vipers, rhubarb, and cinnamon, all mixed into honey. Rich people would take a spoonful of this thick black jam every morning, convinced it made them invincible. It was basically the kitchen sink of drugs. The logic was that if you mix every single substance on Earth into one jar, one of them has to cure the plague, right? It was less of a medicine and more of a culinary panic attack in a spoon. 37. Sneezing is a normal bodily function, but during the plague, it was considered the first step into the grave. This is actually why we say God bless you today. Back then, A sneeze was seen as your soul trying to escape your body or the plague entering it, so people would immediately scream a blessing to shove your soul back in. It wasn't just polite, it was a frantic spiritual emergency procedure. It is funny to think that a simple allergy could cause an entire room of people to start shouting prayers at you, terrified that your nose tickle was about to doom the entire neighborhood. 38. While we are told that an apple a day keeps the doctor away, medieval experts decided that fresh fruit was actually a lethal grenade. Doctors banned the consumption of peaches, melons, and berries because they believed that watery foods would rot inside the stomach and create the plague from the inside out. It is a hilarious dietary twist where they looked at a fresh, vitamin-rich salad and screamed in terror, but then happily prescribed a heavy dinner of salted pork and stale beer. They essentially outlawed the immune system's best friends, convinced that eating healthy was a reckless behavior that would lead to an early grave. 39. The fashion police took things literally when they blamed the plague on pointy shoes. In the 14th century, long-toed shoes called poulaines were the hottest trend, but religious leaders decided that these ridiculous shoes were so ugly that they angered God, who sent the plague as punishment. A legitimate survival strategy was to chop the toes off your footwear to show the heavens that you had good taste. It is the only time in history where wearing Crocs or comfortable sneakers might have been considered a spiritual act of salvation, while being trendy was seen as a biological weapon that doomed the entire continent. 40. If you have ever heard the nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Rosie," you know about the Posy Protection Plan. People believed that carrying a pocket full of flowers acted as a magical shield against the virus. You would see grown men walking through infected cities clutching bouquets of daisies and violets like they were riot shields. The logic was that if you smelled like a garden, the plague would get confused and move on to someone who smelled like a human. They were essentially trying to fight a microscopic killer with floral arrangements, thinking that a nice petal scent was the ultimate hazmat suit. 41. When nice smells failed, the experts did a complete U-turn and invented the poop poultice. Since they believed the plague was a poison trying to get out, they thought the best way to draw it out was to plaster human waste directly onto the skin. People would actually bandage their sores with paste made from the contents of their own chamber pots. It is a stomach-churning level of panic, where someone looked at human waste and thought, "Yes, this is exactly what my open wound needs." They were voluntarily turning themselves into biological hazards, convinced that the only way to get clean was to get as dirty as possible. 34. The word quarantine actually comes from the Italian word for 40, and it was basically a mandatory, boring vacation. When ships arrived in Venice, they were forced to sit in the harbor for 40 days without docking, just to see if anyone died. The crew had to just sit there, staring at the shore, playing cards, and breathing sea air for over a month. It was the original time out for adults. It wasn't really medical treatment, it was just a bureaucratic waiting game where the government said, "We are not sure if you are sick, so go float on that boat until we feel comfortable with you." 43. Since the plague was terrifying, city officials decided to ban anything that was fun, including new clothes and gambling. They passed laws prohibiting the sale of fancy fabrics and banned dice games in pubs, believing that having a good time attracted the devil's attention. The logic was that if everyone was miserable, dressed in old rags, and bored, the plague would lose interest and leave. It is a strategy of aggressive boredom, where the entire population tried to look as unappealing as possible. They were effectively trying to ghost the plague by acting like the most uninteresting people on the planet. 44. Finally, when every ridiculous cure failed, some people adopted the YOLO strategy. Groups of people decided that if the world was ending, they might as well go out partying. They stopped going to work, ignored the doctors, and spent their last coins on massive feasts, drinking, and dancing in the streets. It was a total rejection of safety in favor of having one last rager. While the doctors were eating emeralds and sniffing toilets, these folks were treating the apocalypse like a Friday night at a frat house. It wasn't a cure, but honestly, compared to eating crushed glass or wearing a dead toad, just having a beer and accepting your fate was probably the most rational decision anyone made. After hearing all this, here's the real test. Which one of these insane cures do you think would instantly go viral today if someone on TikTok hyped it as an ancient secret? Drop your guess. I want chaos in the comments. If this video made you laugh and question humanity at the same time, hit like and subscribe. You're going to need it for what comes next.